Live from the Talking Joe studios. It's Talking Joe.
Talking Joe is on the air.
Hey, it's me, Mark, and welcome to Talking Joe. It is the leading dedicated G.I Joe comics podcast. At least that's what my brother tells me. Today we have got a very special guest with us to talk all things G.I Joe comics. But before we bring him on, let's introduce my co-host. It's a real American Tim. It's Tim Finn.
Hello, Mark, and hello, listeners.
So, Tim, we've got an extra special guest today. That guest is Michael Kelly. He's the VP Global Publishing for Hasbro. He is the acting global franchise lead for G.I Joe. He started in 2006 as the senior publishing manager and has been at Hasbro for 16 years, including 11 years at the helm of Hasbro's global publishing department. I hope that's all accurate. Hello, Michael.
That sounds about right. Hello, Tim. Hello, Mark. It's good to be on the show.
Hello, Michael. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Excellent. So before we get all into the detail of your role at Hasbro and where we are today with G.I. Joe, maybe we just start with a young Michael Kelly. So what was your first exposure to G.I. Joe?
So I'm going to date myself here, but my first exposure to G.I. Joe goes back to the 70s. So I do remember the 12-inch Adventure Team. But by the time I was really, getting into it and collecting some of the toys, etc., I was around 10 years old in 1982, right when Real American Hero debuted. So for me, I remember having friends whose older brothers played with the 12-inch Joes. So I always remember seeing them around and messing around with them. But for me, Real American Hero is really my intro to G.I. Joe.
Were you discovering the toys first, the comic book, the TV animation?
Yeah, so for me, it was the toys primarily, and then a bit of the show too. I actually did not read comics as a kid, believe it or not. So I was late to that party, but certainly I've made an effort to catch up in the convening years.
Since we are so comics centric, we will drill in here. When did you get into comics, and when did you become aware of the monthly G.I. Joe series?
So I think I was always aware of it, because obviously I would see it on shelves, and back then you go into the pharmacy or the drugstore, and there'd be the racks, the spinner racks with comics. But certainly the idea that it was written by Larry Hama, and really the backstory of that, I certainly did not know that until much later. But I really started getting involved with comics quite late. It was really my Hasbro job that got me involved. And so right around 2006, I'd certainly dabbled with a few things here and there prior to that, but never really got into the genre until I was professionally in that business.
We are not looking to embarrass anyone who comes to comics late. We just appreciate sort of an accurate timeline, because everyone's connection with and journey alongside G.I. Joe is different, and there's no too late to get into any any of this. When I'm on this podcast, I feel free to talk about comics, and then I go to a convention where the focus is much more on toys, and a little sheepishly, I don't want to tell people that I tend not to buy the toys these days.
Yeah, it's funny, being the head of Hasbro Publishing, and and obviously running the comic book business since 2008. I think there is a level of looking in the mirror and saying, "Wow, how'd you miss this for so many years?" But I like to think that in some ways it gives me a little bit of a benefit, because I'm on the outside looking in. I'm experiencing these things in some ways for the first time. And so for me, it's discovering Joe, Transformers, all the comic books that I kind of missed out on as a kid. It's been really exciting to get into them now with the perspective of an adult, if you will. So, I think that there's something to be said for for having been there from the start, but to be sure. But I think there's also, I don't bring any, I guess what I would say is I don't bring any pre-existing notions or determinations of what Joe needs to be or what it should be. And, I think probably some people would say, oh, that's not a good thing. But from my perspective, I think it allows me to be more open-minded in terms of when creators bring projects and say, we'd like to do this and we'd like to do that. And, I think it just gives me the ability to allow that a bit more and provide that kind of flexibility that, possibly somebody who started with it right from the beginning might just have a harder time or yeah.
That is a little bit of people we know or someone who's speaking right now.
And that's fine. I always love engaging with the real fans who have been with it from the start. And, I always like to make sure that I'm listening and taking their perspective into mind. And then also, a big part of my job is, of course, making sure that G.I. Joe is still relevant and part of our culture 30, 40 years from now, right? When sadly, some of us on this call may not really be around for much longer, but I want to make sure that legacy gets passed on to a next generation, right? So it's always that balance of honoring the original fans while also being sure that we're welcoming new people into G.I. Joe.
And I saw in another interview that you sort of mentioned that you were a fan of some of the G.I. Joe creator-driven works that have been released recently, like Sierra Muerte from Michel Fife and Transformers versus G.I. Joe from Tom Scioli, which are sort of very outside of the kind of the tradition of the kind of the more adventurous style of a particular artistic style, and it's much more of an individual creator's stamp on the property.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that for me, what always intrigued me with the comic medium, particularly, and actually drove me to want to take this on when I started at Hasbro, because my first job at Hasbro was not involved with comics. My experience with comics, although not particularly in depth, was always the fascination with the interpretation and the creativity of different artists and writers, and the idea that there's a broader latitude within comic books that allow, I think, a personal viewpoint to be explored than other genres or media, if you will. So, obviously a movie or a TV show is going to, particularly on a property like a G.I. Joe or a Transformers, where there's a commercial element to it. There needs to be a consistency, and there needs to be a, I guess, uniformity of vision, if you will, that drives a particular story. Whereas I feel comic books allow unbridled creativity, and so what I really enjoy is that opportunity to say, okay, well, we do have the mainline comic book story, if you will, whether it's Larry Hama or whatever the main book is that's going along. That's going to kind of cleave to that more brand-centric concept of the characters. But the opportunity to say, let's do something really experimental. Let's do something that is that just might really surprise people. And obviously, it's not for everybody. Some people are going to love it. Some people are going to hate it. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are going to fall in between. But I think it's important to always press those boundaries and say, what's a different vision of this story? What's a different vision of these characters? And, how far can we explore those limitations? So for me, it's just, it is really that ability to take somebody else's vision and empower them to tell a story that they want to tell. And then just see how it falls and see how people react to it, and, build upon the successes and maybe, rethink some of the things that don't work out as well. So
this is a good point and worth hovering over for a moment. When there is a G.I. Joe film or TV show, I think it can be hard for everyone, me included, to imagine what that show or movie would have been if it had been, say, similar, but a different writer, director, art director. With a comic book, I think when it's written and drawn by one of these sort of writer-artists cartoonists, auteurs. I think because they tend to be such singular, quote, visions, I think it is sort of easier to see it as such a particular take on G.I. Joe and to sort of extrapolate how it might be if that particular ingredient of that writer artist wasn't there. And, you know, a G.I. Joe film, thousands of hands make that. A G.I. Joe show, hundreds or thousands of hands make that. And a comic book might be as few as 11 people. And maybe I'm so in comics, you know, I can look at a comic and say, I know who drew that, or I've got a couple of guesses. And with a film, you know, if someone made a G.I. Joe film and I didn't see any credits and they showed it to me, I would not be able to guess who had written it and directed it.
Mm.
Yeah, so I sort of had a slight deviation there away from talking about a young Michael Kelly, but at some point that young Michael Kelly became a slightly older Michael Kelly and started looking for jobs. So what was the route that you took that brought you to Hasbro?
So that's a great and sort of interesting meandering story, to be honest.
we like meandering story. This is not a short podcast necessarily.
So I was always very engaged in reading as a child. That was like one of my main pastimes. And so when it was time to go off to university, I was an English major, studied literature, and, you know, was really immersed in that, but also sort of realizing that it could be difficult to come out with any real profession other than, you know, people, every time you're an English major, the first question people ask is, are you going to be a teacher, right? And of course, for me, I really didn't have interest in being a teacher. I just was more interested in language and storytelling and the that art form, if you will. So, and I'm not. I think I recognized early on that there's a difference between being a writer and being a storyteller. And a writer, I certainly am not, but a storyteller, I am. And so, you know, I think that was really a good background. And as I started going through, getting towards graduation, realizing that I think, you know, a career in the book business is what I would really enjoy doing. So out of school, I started working at a bookstore, at a Barnes & Noble, worked my way through that for a while, and then landed my first job at a children's book publisher outside of Boston, and worked there for a few years, and moved over to a company that actually specialized more in things like self-help books and business books, things like that. So not quite as creative and I think rewarding as the children's book side of things. And after being with that company for about 6 years, I realized it was time for a change. And believe it or not, I started interviewing at two very different places at the same time, one of which was Hasbro for the senior manager job on the publishing team. And the other was with the Central Intelligence Agency. So a little bit different dynamics there. And I actually got pretty far with both, and got to the point where I had to make a decision which one I was going to do. And, I think there was an interest still for me to pursue literature and publishing. And so it was, I was leaning towards that anyway. And then, when you find out what the CIA pays these people who risk their lives, you have a lot more respect for what they do. So I felt like I probably should go with the direction that would help me support a family eventually, and also not put myself at risk every day. So Hasbro it was, and I ended up really at the beginning. It was at that time Hasbro Publishing was really sort of, I don't want to say an afterthought necessarily, but it was a very small part of the Hasbro organization. Revenues were very small. There were only 3 people on the team, me being one of them. And it was really sort of looking at storytelling for brands in a, kind of a simplistic way, I guess. It was, if it was a TV show, you took the TV show and you adapted it into a kid's book. If it was, there were obviously there were still comics. There were comics going on at that time, but it was sort of this is the story you tell. This is the story that Hasbro will approve, and that's the be all end of it. And so it was just it was a business that was certainly not neglected, but I think underdeveloped at that time. And I think there just wasn't really a strong realization of what the opportunity potentially could be. And so about a couple of years later, 2008, the opportunity to manage the comic book business opened up, and I jumped at that. And, really at that point started to look, as we just spoke about, look to the creators to drive the story, look to outside ideas of, what do you think this could look like and where could the story go? And really being more collaborative and more open to new and different ideas. And, and that spread across the business, right? So we still do adaptations of kids shows into books, but we now do a lot of original storytelling. In fact, I would say at this point, across all our brands and our different publishing formats, about 60% of what we do is original storytelling as opposed to adaptations of entertainment. And that really has changed things dramatically, right? So we went from that small 3-person team. Now it's a team of 14. We have offices in London, Paris, Shanghai, and Mexico City, as well as Rhode Island and New York. And, we're doing about 1,000 titles per year. So, so that's kind of how I got to it. It was a bit of a meandering path, and I never, it was never a goal per se to say, like, I need to figure out how to go work for Hasbro, but the opportunity arose, and, it's been almost 17 years now.
Wow.
Michael, go for it, Mark.
I was going to say that, sort of alluding to those early days, and what was interesting is that given you've been now at Hasbro a long time, you were there during the switch from Devil's Due publishing to IDW. That sort of was around about 2008, 2009.
Yep.
All of these years on, we're sort of in a similar position of seeing a new era from moving from IDW to a new publisher. Yes, how involved were you in the comics during that period, and what can you sort of tell us about what that kind of activity was like of sort of moving to the new publisher? And you sort of mentioning starting new ideas, and I can definitely, as you were saying that, sort of it was resonating with me about what a, I guess, fertile period the sort of the launch of G.I Joe at IDW was.
Yeah, so I literally took over the comic business right after my predecessor had made the decision to move to IDW. So it was sort of that transition period where Devil's Due was still the licensee, but we knew that we were moving on to IDW. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of this transition period of making sure that we wrapped things up as best as we could with Devil's Due, and then launched with IDW in as strong a way as possible. So I personally had very little interaction with the Devil's Due team because it was really more just a handover, if you will, of, this is, we're winding you down and we're winding IDW up. So, so that's really where I came in. And so, if you look at my career in terms of the comic book business, it is very much tied to the IDW run, because it was right around then. So it was 2008. And I took over. IDW launched a little, I think, towards the end of that year. That was the same time that Andy Schmidt was working at IDW, if you recall him. And he had just come on to basically be the Hasbro guy, right? The IDW's liaison and editor over the Hasbro books. So he and I worked closely together in those early months. Him being brand new to IDW, and me being, couple of years in at Hasbro, but brand new to the comic book business. So yeah, that's that lines up.
Tim, did you have a particular question that I interrupted?
Yeah, I might be jumping a little ahead, but maybe this will jump us ahead. Michael, you and I have spoken before, and in describing your job, and maybe it was sort of more of that era, this is some years ago, I recall you described yourself something like an editor, that there might be other words in your job title, but that you were sort of like the Hasbro editor, or the person at Hasbro who was running interference and helping to decide story direction with your partners. And I found that word, editor, like, oh, Michael Kelly's sort of the Hasbro editor. Because I know what a vice president is, but sometimes I don't think I actually know what a vice president is. And there are many different kinds of vice presidents, big businesses and banks have them, schools have them. And sometimes it seems like companies have so many of them that, and governments have them. So can you talk about that word, editor? Because you have talked about writer and storyteller.
Yeah. So obviously, and I think you make a good point, like what is a vice president? And, I think that the biggest evolution of my job from the time when I was, my title at that time officially was senior manager of publishing, to vice president. Obviously, vice president, at least at Hasbro, implies that you are overseeing a team and, more of a division as opposed to a part of a business, if you will. So, I think a lot of what my job has evolved into now is managing that team of 15 people that I just mentioned, and, ensuring that the strategy is set, things of that nature. But, those early days, and to an extent still, I'm not as involved just for time, reasons of time management. I'm not as involved on that editorial process as I was, but in those early days, certainly I was reading every single manuscript. I was looking at every panel of pencils that were coming through, and with particularly on the art side, working closely with an art director to make adjustments in that nature. So and then really just kind of guiding and crafting the language of the story and ensuring that we were heading in the right direction, nudging things where necessary. You said running interference. Certainly there's a good amount of that, particularly in those early days. There was a lot of, I wouldn't say hesitancy, but there was a lot of maybe nervousness or a bit of anxiety on sort of the corporate side of Hasbro in terms of, is it okay to tell these kinds of stories? Should we push the envelope this far? So, a lot of my job was advocating, in a sense, on behalf of the creative teams and trying to push through some of the more, I guess, I'm drawing a blank on the word that I want right now, but I guess maybe daring, risky, like some of those more out of left field type of stories that Hasbro just wasn't accustomed to at that point, right? It wasn't necessarily that they didn't want to tell them, but just that they hadn't, and that it was it was new ground to work through. So, but on that editorial side, definitely, literally sitting down and reading through manuscripts and here and there adjusting a phrase or a scene or giving some art direction in terms of how I visualized something playing out in the panels. I think that was a big part of it. To give you an example, when we were working on the Cobra miniseries, which has now been collected as The Last Laugh, the Chuckles story, the original concept came through, and the big bad guy, if you will, was Major Blood. And, reading through the initial concepts of that story, it was a solid story, but, I kept coming back to Major Blood and thinking, I don't know that this is the right character for this story. And, so basically went to Andy and the writer, Mike Costa, and said, what if we use the twins, Tomax and Zaymot, and use them in a way that Chuckles doesn't know that they're actually two people. So it's like that kind of an idea. And then, both of them agreed, and Mike ran with it. And, his work on that series is some of the best I've ever worked on, without a doubt. But, that's sort of that level of editorial, I guess what I would say, Tim, and you'd be familiar with this, like not so much a line editor, but a content editor, right? Like the kind of more of a guiding hand, helping and assisting where necessary, nudging where necessary. And, to an extent, I still do read a fair amount of the manuscripts that come in. I don't have the time, unfortunately, in my job these days to read everything. But, I have a team that I rely on to do that. So.
And the Cobra miniseries, and then the second Cobra miniseries, and then the ongoing series, you would count that as one of those more, or perhaps most daring stories in comics that Hasbro hadn't been used to up until then.
Yes. definitely. I had a lot of internal conversations in the early days of that story to get people comfortable with that idea. And at the end of the day, I've always been really impressed by how supportive Hasbro was, because easily they, some of the higher ranking people, particularly on the communication side, public relations, those areas that have to worry about things like, what kind of reaction might pop up in the media, and rightly so. They were very supportive. It took some conversations, and it took a little bit of explaining what we were trying to achieve and what the benefit of it would be for the brand and for Hasbro overall. But once they got it, they were 100% supportive. So yeah,
and
but yes,
Mark and I are both fans of that series. So you are explaining to the converted.
Good.
And I guess that experiment and that daring sort of borne out because you've been left with the legacy of the story, and it's been collected in a very handsome hardcover. And I guess if any of the bigwigs in Hasbro or sort of film partners want to say, what can be achieved with G.I Joe, which is for a more mature audience or outside of what the stereotype of the cartoon is, you can now point at that story and say, look, this is something that is possible that you can do in the G.I Joe world.
Yes.
To our listeners who have maybe not started that story or only got through The Last Laugh, the story continues for another 2 years afterwards. And the word Cobra is always in the title. So, for example, the Cobra Files. After Chuckles, after his story is wrapped up, the October Guard shows up, other characters show up. It continues to be great, and it does have a significant sort of epilogue. So that gets my thumbs up, listeners.
Good.
What does your broader role sort of involve and encompass? And I think in my research, I think I saw that you were quoted as saying that you travel like almost a third of the year.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that was pre-pandemic. Things have changed for all of us, and I certainly am not traveling at this stage, even in 2022. And I think in 23 we'll probably still be fairly scaled back when it comes to that. But yes, at the height, and certainly 2015 through 2019, easily on the road 100 days a year. Wow. And that was everything from visiting my team in the various offices, making sure they, had the support that they needed, were implementing the strategy in a way that made sense for them and for their markets, making adjustments as necessary. So a good amount of face time with them in the various countries. Trade shows, obviously. So, in addition to something like San Diego Comic-Con, Bologna Book Fair, which is usually in the spring in Italy, is the largest international children's book show of the year, of the calendar. So, that's a big one that we always attend, and we have a big booth, and it's an exciting one too, because that is strictly publishing. So it's really the only trade show that Hasbro exhibits at that is 100% about the book business. So trade shows as well. And then, and then of course, visiting some of our bigger partners. So whether it's, some of our publishers of children's books or novels in New York City, our comic book partners are mostly out on the West Coast in California. But then, because it's a global business now, we have massive publishers in Poland and the UK and Shanghai, Beijing. So all of those really big partners that are putting out, 40, 50 books a year for us, they get a visit just to make sure that they understand that Hasbro supports them, that we appreciate their business. And, that's part of the job of the head of a division, is to go out there and meet with those companies' CEOs and presidents, and make sure that they understand that we are as committed to them as they are to us. So it's a lot of on the road, it's a lot of dinners, it's a lot of things of that nature. But I've always really enjoyed that aspect of the job, meeting people face to face, learning about the different cultures, and it's just amazing how different storytelling is in different parts of the world, and how you have to adjust things. And I think that's also been a bit of secret of Hasbro's success in publishing over the years is that, we're not forcing the exportation of US or UK titles to the rest of the world. We're encouraging our partners in various places to create their own stories. And again, coming back to that idea of original storytelling, it's not just about expanding the brand and taking risks. It's also, a Chinese child has a different expectation of storytelling than an American one does. And, the only way to really achieve that in a meaningful way is to have a local publisher and local creators work on those, knowing the culture firsthand from having lived it their whole lives. So it's a lot of that as well. So that's the travel aspect. I will say that there is a point where 100 days gets a bit much. So I certainly didn't want to go to 0, which is what the pandemic did to us. But it would have been nice, I think, to if as things start to open up again, I'd love to keep it more in sort of the 60 to 70 range. Be home a little bit more.
Can we put two of these interests of yours together? So if you didn't use the V word, but I was suspecting that you were a voracious reader as a kid. All these trips, if you're not behind the wheel driving a rental car, you're on a plane or a train or at an airport or at a train station. Are you reading a ton?
That's a great question. So it depends on the scenario. I do read a good bit depending on the length of a flight. But believe it or not, this might sound a little bit strange, but because my life is so just insanely hectic, like I'm sure it is for you guys and for everybody, especially these days, but I value the time, particularly in an airplane, like if I'm flying to the West Coast, to do absolutely nothing and just think. So like not read, not watch a movie, maybe look out the window if I've got access to it. But, for the most part, for me, that actual travel time is the time when I am undisturbed. There's really nobody asking me for something. The email's shut off. The phone doesn't work. It's an ability for me to really get introspective and think about where we are in terms of, whether it's storytelling, whether it's, which brand needs some help, which story might be struggling, which things are really successful. So yeah, it probably looks like I'm just staring at the wall, but believe it or not, I spend a lot of time on planes and trains just thinking.
That's surprising and also not surprising. And a writer said to me once, when he's writing, he's sitting at the computer just staring. And it might look like he's not writing because he's not typing, but he's thinking.
Yeah.
And that was Larry Hama. And lots of other writers. Hama didn't invent that.
I think I remember an interview with the writer Charles Soule. I think he said something along the lines of his most productive writing time is when he's going for a jog. No distractions, nothing, no family around asking questions, no other, co-workers, no distractions on the screen in front of him. It's just him, his mind's, ability to think about his next story while he's got that space to be out there running. Actually, that's a segue. I saw on one of your interview profile pictures. It looked like Michael. It looked like you were taking part in Tough Mudder.
Yes, yeah, that is one of my great passions.
Tell us who don't know what that is.
So Tough Mudder is it's a obstacle course race, if you will. Although race maybe isn't quite the right word. I guess challenge is the right word. So Tough Mudder is it was actually originally designed based on the training regimen of the British SAS. So it's meant to incorporate not only physical challenges but mental and emotional challenges as well as you go through the process. But it's usually about a 10 to 12 mile course, which you either can run or jog or walk if you need to, and sometimes you do. And then interspersed in that is anything from, something would be physical, like climbing over barriers or going over cargo nets, things of that nature. In terms of psychological, you might have to, crawl through a dark tube or something like that goes underground and maybe fills up with water. So like a lot of things that are really just kind of challenging you to face your limitations physically and mentally while you're out on the course. But I think what I find most rewarding about it and what makes it different from some of the other obstacle course events that are out there is that Tough Mudder is all about teamwork and camaraderie. So there are literally obstacles out there that you cannot complete by yourself. You need to have somebody help you. And part of the culture around it is that everybody helps everybody else. Even if you've never met the person in your life, you're always going to turn around. You're going to give them a hand. You're going to give them a boost. You're going to encourage them. And, it's not timed. So that's what I said. I misspoke when I said it's a race. It's more of a challenge, an event, because it's not timed. Nobody comes in first, second, or last. And, I think it's this kind of amazing way to go out and just face yourself and push yourself to your limits. And in a way that's really fun and rewarding for me. I've just got, over the years, I've had some really amazing teammates and just some great experiences just with the Tough Mudder community all around.
Is this something you do annually? Does this come to where you live? Do you travel to do it?
Yeah, so it's a bit. Originally, it was more local. So I would always have to travel because usually it's set more in sort of mountainous terrain. So in the New England area, it usually would be Vermont or New Hampshire or once up in Maine. But over the years, my team has slowly whittled down to just one other person. But she and I are very dedicated, and we have now traveled to Toronto for one. We went last year. We actually went to the Tough Mudder in Scotland, or this year, I should say. That was just back in June. And we do a minimum of one a year. We tried to do 2 a year, and we were getting that pretty well in hand until the pandemic hit, and then of course everything got disrupted. So we're back down to 1 per year, but it's definitely the highlight of my year.
Hats off to you, for sure. It sounds like in terms of giving you quiet time to think, it's probably not the event. It sounds full on.
Yeah, you're not thinking about anything when you jump into a 30-yard dumpster filled with ice water.
Wow.
Oh dear.
So this is a little bit of a left turn. I'm looking at the Hasbro portfolio of brands, and I see that My Little Pony has stayed with IDW.
Mm-hmm.
G.I Joe and Transformers are going elsewhere.
Yep.
Boom Studios has Magic the Gathering and Power Rangers.
Yep.
Is this unusual that a company would split its IP between not different publishing partners, like someone who does children's books and then one that does comic books, but say 3 comics publishers?
I don't really know, to be honest, what other companies do or how they approach it. I don't think it's that curious, to be honest. What I would say is that, when I started out and we were working with IDW, it was a natural growth, I guess, if you will, right? So they started out, they just had Transformers, then they added Joe. A little bit later came on with My Little Pony and Dungeons and Dragons, which is the other one that they also still will remain publishing, is Dungeons and Dragons. And then, of course, we expanded that out, and they've done some really interesting things with like Clue, which are some of my favorites. Gem and the Holograms, I think they did an amazing job with Gem. And then, of course, we rolled into the Hasbro universe with ROM, Micronauts, Mask, etc. So it sort of evolved in that way. And then when Hasbro acquired Power Rangers from Saban, that deal came with the Boom Studios relationship already intact, and so it was really just a matter of taking that business over and starting to manage that. And I think, I guess what I would say is that for me, it's really about making sure that our brands are with the teams that are going to really be pushing the envelope and being really creative consistently. And, I don't think as much about where they are as who I think is going to do the best job for the next, say, 3 to 5 years. And then, and I think there is something to be said about having a bit of diversification, if you will, in terms of, especially in these days of upheaval and just challenging business models with the comic book industry in general. It's, to have all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak, is risky, I think. So for me, it's also a little bit of just a strategic safekeeping, I guess, to have a few different options and have various talented teams working on our books, so that if anything unfortunately were to happen to one of them, we still are not, we're not suddenly overnight out of business. Now, I don't obviously think that's going to happen to any of our comic book partners, but I have seen it in my career where you're working with a strong partner and then something, a switch almost flips and they're out of business before you know it. And that can be really damaging if you've got a lot of your business tied up with one company.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go back in time and answer my own question because, of course, around 1987, 1988, Marvel had G.I. Joe and Transformers. DC had Cops.
Right. Wow, that was good.
which I always forget because I don't think of Cops because it's not a Marvel book. And if I'm thinking licensing in the 80s, I'm usually thinking of Marvel. Mm-hmm. And of course, Disney splits its licenses across many different, even comics publishers.
Yeah.
Mark, let me hand the mic back to you.
Okay, so I see your name in the front of the comic book every month. It says special thanks. This is from issue 300, I think. Special thanks to Hasbro's Ed Lane, Tyler Rayo, Michael Kelly for their invaluable assistance. So what are you being thanked for there? What is Hasbro's role in the production of a typical monthly book?
So we're very, very involved. So particularly those three names. So obviously myself, but also Ed Lane is the art director for Global Publishing. So he is, amazingly does this entire job by himself. Which when I mentioned we do about 1,000 books a year. That's all Ed Lane looking at the art, making sure he's a trained artist by trade and skill, and his job is really looking at every panel, every cover, every visual representation of our characters and ensuring that they are on brand and accurate. Now, like I said before, we do allow broad latitude of interpretation within comics, but there are certain aspects that we need to adhere to, right? Because they are the brand tenants, right? So, Optimus Prime has certain colors, G.I. Joe characters have to look a certain way. My Little Pony characters have their own, their colors and their personalities that need to be reflected within the visual experience. So Ed Lane does all of that, which is amazing. And then Taylor is she's our product development specialist and manager. So she oversees the team that manages every piece of material that comes through for approval. She makes sure that it gets to all the people internally, myself included, Ed, also brand team members, publicity. Everybody who needs to see something and approve it or comment on it gets to see it. And it's she and her team that makes sure that happens. And also provides, because she and her team have been with us for long enough that they know the brands in and out as well. So, like I said, it's simply not possible at this point for me to read every single manuscript, but I know that Taylor and her team are looking at them. I know that they're making sure that the story that's being told is the agreed upon story, and that nothing's kind of getting out of parameter, or God forbid, once in a while something sneaks through that maybe is inappropriate, or some salty language that we wouldn't want in a book, because we still are a family company at the end of the day, regardless. So those are the three of us, but I would say at this point, my job, because of where I am, is a bit more on the upfront side. So as opposed to the day to day. So, if we're going to launch a new story arc or a new book, I'm very involved in the upfront of that, crafting that story, approving the concepts and the ideas, and then moving that through to the point where it goes into production. I don't know if readers and fans really know just how involved we are, but
I doubt anyone really has a clue, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, it is funny because, you know, like sometimes I'll read on the fan sites and the fan boards, and they'll be like, oh, you know, IDW did this and I can't believe it, or so and so did that, and it's like, yeah, well, that might have been my decision. Sorry, guys.
I get the impression that, particularly with the G.I Joe book, that it's got a drumbeat of monthly, as you know, when the pandemic isn't getting in the way of printing and that kind of thing. But it's you know, it's got that monthly drumbeat of production, and it's, you know, the script, pencils, inks, colors, letters, you know, approval and out. And somewhere in amongst all of that, it's being reviewed by somebody from Hasbro. And I get the impression that because the timelines are so tight to getting this thing produced and out, it probably can't sit on your desks for too very long for reviewing. I guess you have to be on it to be able to look at this thing as it comes in and get it reviewed, get your comments out very quickly.
Yeah, it honestly can get insane, Mark. You know, we contractually we are always granted 10 days of review time. So once something comes in, we have 10 days under our contracts with our various licensees and publishers that we have to look. But with a comic book, you can't do that, right? Obviously, you can't do that. So, you know, we make every effort to flip things for our comic book partners within 3 days. It doesn't always work out, but that's our goal. So yeah, you know, and when you think about how many books we're doing on the comic book side in the United States alone, and then if you add into that the magazine business in Europe, which we also have a really robust magazine business, which is the same thing, right? I mean, that's also a monthly business, and you know, the amount of things that come through and we have to react to, you know, it's when you look back at Hasbro Publishing in 2006 with 3 people and you say, well, now it's 15 if you include me, you know, that's a big jump, but we are not overstaffed by any means. You know, we are putting in a lot of hours to make sure that these things get out on time, and that we're not the reason that a publisher gets held up.
I'm going to imagine that an earlier relationship like Hasbro and Marvel in the 1980s or early 90s involved so much paper in the mail and faxing, and that now I'm imagining your office or home office might be quite tidy, but your inbox or your sort of server uploads are exploding.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And you know, it's funny that you bring that up, Tim, because you know, I remember my first job in publishing for that kids book publisher. I was a rights assistant. So, you know, when people would buy rights to our books, we would, you know, I was the person who helped get that going. And one of my jobs was duplicating film. And I don't know if you guys have ever had the opportunity to see what film used to look like back when we used film, but it was every color had this sheet of like this clear, thick plastic. I can't remember the name of it was, but the massive, and these things were massive. They were like 3 feet by 2 feet, and you would get them, and each book would have layers and layers of this film, and it weighed a ton. And you know, one of the things that I had to negotiate with my publishers back then was the cost of duplicate film, because they would need to get their own film to be able to produce the book. And you know, that could cost thousands of dollars, because you're literally running off these plastic sheets, these transparent plastic sheets. And you know, if you're familiar with the term black plate change, which is when, you know, we change the text within a book, that's because that was the one plate that you would change. Everything else would stay the same, but you'd move the text, which was the black plate.
You're talking about, say, the English version versus the French version.
Exactly. If it's the same translation,
if it's the same size, same trim, you can use all the same color plates, and your black plate is going to get swapped out.
Exactly.
And you can do the print run together and save money.
Yeah, and it's funny because, you know, we still call it a black plate change, but I haven't seen a black plate in 25 years.
now your comics publisher is sending you a PDF with the lettering layer turned off.
Exactly.
And you're sending that to your foreign partner who's re-lettering it in French. Mm-hmm. So earlier you mentioned the brand team. Mm-hmm. How often, say, with the G.I Joe brand team, how often are you interacting or having a sort of a formal meeting because I understand the schedules of comics, and I sort of understand the schedules of toys. And currently, the G.I. Joe comic is not driven by the toy, nor vice versa. But you and the brand team are still in Hasbro pushing the brands. How often do you meet with or interact with the G.I. Joe brand team?
So we have two different teams now at Hasbro that work on each brand. So we have the toy team, which is the team that is dedicated to the creation of obviously the action figures, et cetera, right? So their job is the design, the speccing, the manufacture, all of that of the toys, and then getting them out and ready for market. And then there's what we call the franchise team. Each brand has a franchise team, and they work very closely with the toy team, but their purview is basically everything else under the brand other than the toy, right? So whether it's entertainment or the licensed products, consumer products, whether it's any kind of storytelling, digital gaming, publishing, et cetera. So for the most part, it's the franchise team on the brand that I'm working with. And what I would say is it depends. The interactivity really depends on where we are in a story. So if we're kicking something off and starting something new, if we're onboarding a new publisher, I would say that we're working with the brand, with that franchise team, certainly weekly, sometimes more than that. So a lot of involvement back and forth, making sure that although the comic stories or whatever story we're telling, we do, to your point, tell our own version of the story, right? So we're not beholden to the toy. We're often not beholden to other forms of entertainment, but we still want to make sure that we are conveying a story that the franchise team feels is going to be beneficial overall to the brand, and is going to hit on maybe some of the key themes that they feel are important to the brand as we move forward. So we interact with them a lot, and then as things start to get into a cadence, and the major story arcs are agreed upon and approved, then their involvement tends to diminish a bit, because once we get into the storytelling phase and the actual details of manuscripts and art panels, they don't need to be as involved. The one exception to that is when we are in fact tying into either a movie or a TV show. They tend to stay involved along with somebody from the studio, just to make sure that we are, just to make sure we're not accidentally spoiling something or going in a direction that might confuse people down the road. Because what we really want to obviously always avoid is creating something that breaks with canon if we're creating canon. So that involves a lot of people to make sure that we stay as close as possible as we can within those confines. So again, certainly somebody from that brand team, franchise team, but also somebody from our studio.
And I guess one of the most visible things in the G.I. Joe world about that joining up of the different parts of Hasbro is that you released this G.I. Joe classified novel from Kelly Scovron, sort of the young adult novel. I guess that's sort of in action, seeing the G.I. Joe sort of emerging brand of G.I. Joe classified meeting publishing.
Yes. Although, I think what we wanted to achieve there really was sort of that recognition of the brand. But I think, anybody who reads the G.I. Joe classified novel, junior novel, if you will, or middle grade novel, quickly realizes that it's not based on those toys, but on the toy line of G.I. Joe classified. But it is, again, it is making sure that the nomenclature and the branding is consistent, so that, if that kid loves that book and wants to go out and find the action figures, they're going to go and they're going to see, these are the characters. Maybe they're adults now and they're grown up, and this is their iteration in other aspects of the Joe world. But yeah, they'll recognize G.I. Joe classified as a branding element.
And the other thing that sort of strikes me is that the degree that particularly the Hammer books in recent years have really kind of seeming to be like sort of in creative overload in terms of generating brand new G.I. Joe creations like Overkill, the sort of robot's got a new design, or Sherlock, who was introduced in the Murder by Assassination arc, and the sort of the big headliner really being Dawn, the female Snake Eyes, who has been so forefront in the books over the last however long it is, quite a number of years anyway. I mean, how important do you think is it to the overall G.I. Joe brand that the comics have got this kind of IP creation going on, and to what extent do you think some of these creations might filter into some of the other elements of the G.I. Joe brand outside of comics?
That it's always difficult to know where something might lead in terms of it becoming part of other aspects of the brand, particularly on the toy side, because, again, it's the overall cost of creating a new toy is so incredibly high that, we obviously always have to be sure that whatever we create is going to sell, and is going to sell in an amount that's going to earn back those remarkable R&D costs. So, so I never like to think too much about whether characters that are created in the comics are going to eventually become a toy. But on the other hand, it has happened. Helix was created in the comics, and and she ended up, she's had several action figures of her, and she's appeared in different. She's been in digital gaming and other aspects of the brand as well. On the Transformers side, of course, Drift was a big comic created character that now has had various iterations in toy, and actually even was in one of the live action theatrical releases. So you never know, and I think it's always really exciting. But for me, particularly with Larry Hama, I've read, certainly when I was starting out and over the last few years, and as we got closer and closer to 300, reading about him in those early days, and people saying, well, what was your inspiration for this character? And he's like, well, they gave me a toy. I had to figure out how to tell a story about this toy, right? And so, I think that's amazing. I think it's great, and I think it's great that he did that, and he was able to do that. And I think, certainly for the early days of the brand, that was terrific. But for me, it's important for Larry now to be able to kind of turn that on its head, right? And be like, well, it's not about them giving me a toy; it's about me giving them a character. And I look at some of the characters that he's created, and it's always, I always appreciate his. He comes at it from the perspective of what's the team missing? What makes sense in this case or this story? What character do I not have to pull from the ranks that needs to be created? And are there characters that are or are there people who are underrepresented at the moment? And so bringing in more women with really significant and important roles. People of color. I love Molto. I thought he was a fantastic addition, and I understand that part of that was some fans literally saying, gosh, we'd love to see a Filipino Joe, and Larry was like, yeah, all right, I'm going to do that. That's a great idea. So I think again, it comes back to that trusting our creators and giving them the latitude to create the story that is meaningful to them, because that's when the passion's going to come through, right? If you're sitting over their shoulder and dictating, you got to do this and you have to do that, and it has to look like this because I don't know, because that's what it looked like in 1980, or that's what the toy that's coming out next season is going to look like. You're taking away the key benefit of working with a creative source, right? I mean, you have to give them that freedom to create what they have in their heart and in their mind, or you're just going to keep going in circles. And so, when I look at these characters that Larry has created recently, I love them. I just think it's great. And, there's probably people that aren't so happy about them for various reasons. And, I'm sorry for that. But, again, I think it comes back to making sure that G.I. Joe is still relevant and people are still reading these comics long after I am no longer the head of publishing, right? I mean, it's not about the next year or the next 2 years. It's not about the last 15 years. It's about how are we going to keep people engaged? How are we going to bring new audiences in? And I think you do that by continuing to evolve the story and the characters.
I think of a character like RC, introduced in 1986 in the animated Transformers the movie. And RC shows up in the next year of the TV cartoon. And nowadays, characters in Transformers like RC and Windblade and is it Minerva? They are a big part of the storytelling. And if you look sort of across the 30-year timeline, it's almost like RC was a seed that was planted in 1986 when the line wasn't ready, the market wasn't ready, and maybe some of the decision making at Hasbro wasn't ready for, a female Autobot. And you were taking this long view with, what might G.I. Joe be or benefit from or need in 20, 30, 40 years. And I think Mark and I might represent some of the fandom that is excited and impatient because we see Don Marino show up, get developed over a year or two, get a really cool costume. And Larry Hama said, I designed this character to be cosplayable, which I thought was a really amazing and astute sort of like starting point, right? Like, yes, she's evolved in the character. She's an ex-Cobra. She's a ninja. But so much of fan culture these days is that kind of expression, going to a convention and making a costume. Mm-hmm. And as sort of a comparison, Marvel Comics introduces just as a one-shot character, this one comic book, Gwen Stacy from another universe is Spider-Woman, right? So quote, Spider-Gwen. Mm-hmm. And Marvel is surprised when sort of between the character getting announced and the publication of the comic, people are making that costume and posting photos. And so the editors at Marvel say, oh, maybe we should make this character show up more, give her own series, right? And then she's in an animated movie and almost overnight, this is a big deal character. And I look at Don Marino and sort of rubbing my hands together like, okay, when's the action figure? Or when's the 3-pack of like the new characters that Hama just introduced? And so I hear you that, you'd have to work in partnership with the 2 brand teams, or was it the IP team and the brand team, the toy team. But it might be that I just have to, in the way that, RC as an Autobot really shows up in 86, but that kind of character sort of grows and blossoms 20, 30 years later. I might need to be patient that, there might be a G.I. Joe movie in 25 years and it's just all about Don Marino. And I can wait that long.
Yeah. And I think too, Tim, to your point that it's like, that's part of why I feel so strongly about ensuring that we're bringing new people into the brand and really broadening the appeal and the accessibility of G.I. Joe to a new generation and to a broader audience because that's how we get things like that, right? I mean, I think a lot about Oldsmobile, the old car company, right? And this was when I went to business school, this was one of the cases that we studied. And Oldsmobile, basically, they made decent cars and, they had a very loyal fan base. And, and as things started to change and evolve, people kept saying, well, Oldsmobile, you need to do this and do that. And then there are things like, no, we have a loyal fan base. We have a loyal customer. They like what we do. We do it really well, and we're going to keep doing it. And literally what happened was that their entire customer base died, and they never replaced it. And now there's no such thing as Oldsmobile. Right. So I think about that a lot, and it's, it might sound kind of dramatic in some ways, but it's, I don't ever want to be Oldsmobile, and I certainly don't want G.I. Joe to ever be Oldsmobile, right? I want G.I. Joe to continue to grow and evolve and appeal to audiences, and I don't want to ever lose those core fans that have been with it from 1982 or earlier. But I also need their help in making sure that they're bringing their their kids, their nephews and nieces, their, friends' kids, whatever, into this brand and getting them excited and finding what that touch point is. And, I think sometimes we just have to be honest with ourselves that, a 10-year-old kid right now is probably not going to be all that excited about the first 25 or 100 issues of the Marvel run of G.I. Joe Real American Hero. They might get to that point, right? They might evolve into that point where they're in the brand and they love G.I. Joe and they're like, I want to really dig deep into this, and oh wow, look at this, there's all this stuff from the 80s and I'm going to get into that, and they'll eventually probably end up loving that as well. But we have to find places and opportunities to bring these new people in, because as the brand grows and brings in more people and more people are excited about it, that's when we have, in a sense, the critical mass, if you will, for Don Moreno to become an action figure and a movie star. And, that's when we start to see a broader encompassing of offerings, because, again, you get to a point where it's like, well, everything's Snake Eyes, everything's Duke and Scarlet. And it's like, well, yeah, because those are, we know that that's what people want. But if you get to the point where there's a bigger fan base and more people excited in different parts of the brand, then you're going to get back to that point where, you have a cast of thousands, and you have, you have all the action figures and characters that you want to see either in digital gaming or movies or TV shows or toy, whatever it is. But, but we need to keep growing. We need to keep this fan base vibrant and alive and growing.
Indeed. Yeah, the sort of the big success story has been G.I. Joe Classified, and I don't think anyone was expecting or ready for that to be as successful and as popular as it has been. And some of the older collectors are gonna have fallen in love with it. Some of them have been, this isn't the G.I. Joe I knew from when I was little, but I guess that's fine if it's what's going to bring in the newer collectors, the kids. It's the Classifieds is what my 11-year-old breaks out and plays on his bedroom floor with. That can only be a good thing to sort of energize G.I. Joe, bring back lapsed fans, bring in the new generation.
Yeah, one of the things that because I've had some conversations at Comic-Con and other places sometimes where, somebody might be upset, a little, heated maybe about the direction that some things have gone in. And it's like, this isn't the Joe that I remember from the 80s. And I appreciate that. And I understand that feeling to a degree. But what I try to ask people to think about when they're thinking about the brand and what it means to them is not, I want this child or this young person who's interested potentially in Joe to have the exact experience that I had. But I want them to have the experience that I had insofar as this was the moment that I knew that I loved G.I. Joe and that I loved this brand and this story. And what is that touch point? What is that moment for a new fan? And it might not be it's not going to be probably the exact same experience that you had as your moment of experiencing. Like mine for G.I. Joe was when, that Christmas morning I got up and I had my first G.I. Joe figure under the tree, and it was Breaker, and I thought it was the most awesome thing ever, with his little headset, and like, what's that moment? And envision that moment for that kid in your life, whether it's the kid down the street or your own child or your niece or nephew, whatever it is. What is that moment that for them is going to be not exactly the same as what you had, but is going to elicit the same response and the same excitement and the same passion? And how do we create those moments for those new possible fans and make sure that they have the experience that you had, maybe different, but emotionally and, psychologically, I guess, that same experience of, aha, this is the brand for me. This is the story that I want to be a part of.
Something I need to remind myself occasionally if I look at G.I. Joe now and I think, well, this is different than, quote, my G.I. Joe from the 80s. All of us kids who came in the 80s were bringing in a G.I. Joe that was very different from the previous G.I. Joe. And there were there were fans and toy collectors from the 60s and 70s who looked at, wait, it's a team? Wait, they're small? Wait, the clothing isn't fabric. It's not changeable.
Yeah, right.
It's like, oh, wait, there's a show? I don't know about that. And so Mark and I have talked about the concept of custodian, that someone who's writing a comic book of a character or characters that have been around for a long time is a custodian of them. And when that person isn't writing that book in a year or 20, there will be someone else. And in a way, sort of we fans are, in our fandom, custodians. And there will be other fans after who, hopefully, who have a different relationship and are interacting with different products and stories.
Yep, definitely. And, I think we owe it to those fans. We owe it to those fans that haven't even been born yet to make sure that it's still here and it's still relevant when they're ready. And I take that I take that very seriously. That is one of the driving impetuses behind my job, is that belief, to your point, that yes, we are custodians. This is my brief time on this brand, on this book, to guide this in a way that, I think is the right way, for the broadest possible fans base. And, people can disagree with that. Sometimes sometimes I'll be wrong. Sometimes I'll be right. A lot of times it'll be somewhere in between, but, it's that real dedication to something that existed before I was born. And, shame on me if it's not still here when I'm gone.
If we can return to a point that you sort of brought up a little bit earlier, you said that, when looking at maybe some forums or whatever, fans are discussing the comic and there's things that maybe they don't agree with, and you go, okay, maybe that isn't the writer, maybe that's me. Is there any particular examples that you can bring to mind of maybe some of the sort of the direction that you've influenced in the books? If there's anything specific that sort of comes to mind.
I think it's basically any time it's it's kind of any time it's not a real American hero. I guess, for specific, I think, one of the projects that I was the most excited about recently was Paul Aller's run on Joe. And, that really came, the underlying concept of that was something that I had come up with. And, the execution by Paul was certainly vastly superior to my initial idea. But the idea basically that the Joe team, instead of being this, highly trained, highly financed special operations force of one of the most powerful and wealthiest nations on Earth, is actually just a kind of a ragtag bunch of resistance fighters. And, basing it a lot on what I've learned about the British Special Operations Executive during World War II, which was civilians that were recruited basically to be spies, saboteurs, even assassins at times. And they were just, these normal, everyday people who were put into extraordinary situations and performed beyond expectations. And, the SOE was actually the only British armed forces segment that was integrated with both women and men in the field doing actual operations. And, I just loved that idea of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And I think that that's such an important part of the G.I Joe brand. And so I wanted to capture that. And I think that Paul did an amazing job pulling in that idea of, Cobra has won, Cobra has taken over. G.I Joe is literally just, there are some obviously that are ex-military or and have that kind of combat training, but they're bringing in people who are simply civilians that are fed up and don't want to live under occupation and are willing to fight back for their freedom and what they believe in. And I think there was a fair amount of pushback on that story. And I get it. I understand that there are people for whom the brand really needs to stay within certain parameters. And, I come back to what I say is, what I try to do is always make sure that I have something for everybody, right? So that, Larry Hama continues to write Real American Hero. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as he wants to keep writing it, he'll keep writing it. And, so what I always want to do is to make sure that I'm providing as best as I can that part of the brand that those core fans really want and that they really love, and it's important to them. And I want to make sure that they always have that. I guess what I sort of ask is that if you don't like something else, you don't even have to give it a chance, but maybe just let other people enjoy it and come into the brand that way, because my goal is to continue to give the hardcore fans and the longtime fans from the 80s as much as possible what they want. But again, like I said before, it's my job to ensure that audience continues to grow and increase over time.
This is a key point, and I made this once on my blog, where one of the things that's so exciting to me about G.I. Joe now and in the last decade plus is that in the 80s, though the continuity of the story of the comic book, the TV cartoon, and the action figures, if you're counting the story of the file card dossiers, those were all different, but it was all basically the same G.I. Joe. It wasn't like there was this other G.I. Joe over there, like the World on Fire story that you just mentioned. Mm. And I looked with a lot of longing at other brands like Transformers, where, at any one time, Transformers has 3 or 4 different takes, different continuities, different sort of age groupings, right? There's the movies, which have a particular feel and a very particular look. And there are, quote, legends or quote, classics toys, which are for a certain group or two. There's something for 3-year-olds. There's a comic book that may be very specifically at, like the 1990 crowd. And for a long time, G.I. Joe could only have one of these at a time. And maybe it was Real American Hero, or maybe it was something, maybe during a year of a live action movie, you could have 2, maybe 3, right? There was the action figures, there was Real American Hero, there was Resolute, and there was Renegades, and then there's a live action film. And that's really, for a moment we had several. And so I would agree with you and also ask fans, like, okay, hey, the World on Fire series isn't replacing Larry Hama's Real American Hero series. And fans, if you also buy the World on Fire series, that actually only helps the Real American Hero series. And not buying it, I mean, comics are expensive, and if you're on a budget, I get it. But not buying, sort of as a protest, the World on Fire series or the World on Fire collection, that does send a particular message, and in a way, sort of a harsh message. I don't want it to sound like I'm trying to blackmail fans, like, you ought to support G.I. Joe, so G.I. Joe's still around. But we all have to support G.I. Joe, so G.I. Joe's still around, right? Like, Transformers doesn't need as much of my help because, Transformers is doing great in all sorts of territories and in all sorts of expressions. And, I'm always looking for more people to, read G.I. Joe and buy G.I. Joe and watch G.I. Joe.
I had a very specific question now. I think about the comic, the ARA comic. There was a sort of a subplot where there was a secret bit of the pit that was unveiled, and there was this giant eye, and there was some robots under tarpaulins. And in the comic books, it was kind of revealed that in the letter pages, it was hinted at that there was a plan to have a Transformers crossover of some sort, which didn't happen, and so the sort of story went off in a different direction. And not long afterwards, there was Revolution, and the Hasbro universe launched. Are you able to talk to that kind of plot development and how the kind of the Hasbro verse came about, Michael?
Yeah. So, I think that there's the Hasbro universe is something that still intrigues me, because I think it's something that you don't want to push too far, but on the same token, I think there's a history of it, particularly between G.I. Joe and Transformers, obviously going all the way back to the 80s. So, I think it's important to think about what makes sense in a world that's going to be a shared universe versus something that's kind of got to be forced together and cobbled together where maybe it doesn't make as much sense. But, the initial plan back when Revolution came out was that there was going to be a bigger push around a Hasbro universe at that time. One of the things that we tend to do in publishing as well is a bit of test and learn, I guess, if you will, or, I don't want to say market research because it's not as cold as that because, we are obviously telling stories and we're engaged in those stories. But it is sort of what would happen if we were to explore this, without investing the literally hundreds of millions of dollars that have to go into a theatrical production or even a TV show, right? So, that ability to float an idea, to test some things out, to see how things interact is something that we can do in comics. And I enjoy doing, I think it's one of the things that, again, makes it exciting because it's almost it's a what if, as opposed to, this is what we're establishing and, love it or leave it kind of a mentality. It's more of a what if this happened and what would it look like and will fans enjoy it? And so that's really how that came about was this sort of broader idea of do we have an opportunity here as an organization and can we test it out with IDW and the publishing? And I think that the story was interesting. We definitely tried to ensure that the brands that we were using fit in a logical sense, right? Does Mask make sense in a world where Transformers exist? I think it does because it's kind of reverse engineering technology from Cybertron into an Earth-based concept. Does Micronauts work? It does from a science fiction standpoint. And I think that there's certainly an opportunity there too. But, again, it's really about how fast and how quickly do you want to go in terms of those stories. But, what I come back to the fact that I think, G.I. Joe and Transformers, they can easily coexist. And it's a coexistence that I think makes perfect sense in a lot of ways. And, I think it's ripe for storytelling at any given time. I think it's fun to put those two brands together at different times and explore stories of that sort of amazing dichotomy of these 30, 40-foot transforming robots from another planet versus a group of highly trained specialists, of Earth's fighting force. But, again, I think it comes back to that idea of, what's the relevance of G.I. Joe in a world where there's these giant robots, but again, coming back to that concept of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, it's not much more extraordinary than when you're working with Transformers. So I just think it's fun. I think there's a long history of it within both brands, and I'd love to keep telling stories along those lines when it's appropriate.
I know the market has decided, but as the Hasbroverse was running, building up to Revolution and then to First Strike, I had a great time reading all those books. But I will admit, since I own a comic book store, it is easier for me to read all of those comics than some of our customers who might be on more of a budget.
Yeah, and I think I think that's a great lesson learned too. And like I said, it is sometimes it's a learning experience, and you do have to be really cognizant of how much people can invest in the project and in your brands. And I think that was that's a valuable learning that you sometimes you just can't expect people to be buying 10 books a month. Especially at $3.99, $4.99 a book these days.
But if Real American Hero were to be weekly, with some side miniseries and specials, I think you might be surprised how many Real American Hero readers could go close to 10 books a month.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I think is always fun too is, in terms of the idea of shared universes, is not necessarily, big crossovers all the time, but just like little fun things like, having a Joe character like on a Saturday afternoon at a barbecue wearing the concert T-shirt that he or she got at the Gem and the Holograms concert, that weekend. It's just like it's like a little Easter egg for those who get it. But I mean, does that mean that we've now got a combined universe with G.I. Joe and Gem and the Holograms? No, but it means that, you can imagine that they exist in the same world, and why not? So I think there's just fun things that you can do within the confines of a book that can kind of have some fun with those notions.
Yeah, there's also an example like the two Transformers, My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic crossover miniseries, where those are it's the 1984 animated Transformers and the 2000s Friendship is Magic universe, and each issue is 2 short stories, and it's aimed at a younger reader, although lots of older readers read Friendship is Magic. Mm-hmm. And if you want your Transformers to be more continuity heavy or gritty, you can skip that. But that's also a good book to show to younger readers because it's really friendly and not too gritty.
Yep.
A thought occurred to me as I was talking about that storyline with the giant eye that potentially was hinting at the Transformers joining the ARA universe, but didn't. But that storyline did eventually lead to the death of Snake Eyes. How contentious was that an issue with Hasbro Publishing?
That was anytime we want to go down the path of killing off a main character in the comics, it does tend to be a eye-opening conversation at Hasbro, to be sure. And I think, again, part of it is sort of the miracle of comics where you can be dead, and then, oh my gosh, you weren't actually dead, you're back. And I think that part of it is explaining to people who aren't familiar with the comic medium and the sort of ins and outs of the genre of like, well, listen, it's comic book dead, So if it doesn't go well, or if you get really upset, we'll figure out how to bring him back in a really dramatic and exciting way. But on the same time, I think it's important to keep people guessing and to really not have too many sacred cows, because again, if you go into a story and that all the good guys are always going to come out all right at the end, and the bad guys are always going to get their righteous comeuppance, then that's a dull story, right? I mean, you can do that for 6 issues, maybe 12 if you're lucky. But I think, the idea that your favorite characters aren't necessarily safe, that's an important message to give. And I think, it ups the stakes. It makes it more realistic in a way. And, I do struggle a bit with that line between making things realistic, having good solid stakes that are anxiety inducing and drama producing, but at the same time not getting to the point where it's so gritty that it's going to turn off a part of the audience that really isn't up for that and didn't come to the brand for that. And I think one of the things that's important to me about G.I. Joe is that they genuinely be heroes, right? That they are doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And, do they sometimes have to use means that they would prefer not to? Yeah, of course. That's the way things happen in the real world. But, I don't want to project G.I. Joe as a whole as characters who will do whatever is necessary to achieve their ends, right? I mean, I want them to be heroic. I want them to be aspirational. And I think, the world needs that to an extent. I think we want heroes that we can not only look up to, but that we could actually emulate in some ways, right? I mean, I think the thing that I've always loved about the G.I. Joe brand and team and story is that, you don't have to be from outer space. You don't have to have been bitten by a radioactive bug. You don't have to, you don't have to be a mutant or anything like that. You just have to use the gifts that you have, right? Your intelligence, your physical stamina, your determination, your courage, those things that all of us have in different measure. That's what it takes to be a Joe, right? And that's all that it takes to be a Joe. And I think that's a great story. And the more that we can emphasize that, I think the more it makes the brand really relevant to a broad audience.
I like the point that you made about sort of keeping us second guessing, keeping the audience on its toes with the death and potential return of Snake Eyes, because having just read issue 300, and spoilers here for anyone who's not, we sort of do see the return of at least a Snake Eyes. And reading the issue and looking forward to the next one, I genuinely don't know, is this going to be the new status quo? Snake Eyes is back in close to his original form, or is he going to die in the next issue? It could be either at this point.
Yeah, Mark and I have talked a lot over the last year, and with a couple, guests on our podcast about what would happen, and I was wrong. I was certain Snake Eyes would not come back in 300, and I know plans can change over the course of a year, and maybe an earlier plan was Snake Eyes is definitely not coming back. And I was sort of pleasantly surprised. I mean, I think I chuckled out loud, and my wife said, "What is it?" And I said, "They brought him back." I was sure they wouldn't. I said so last week on the podcast. I guess I'm wrong. I'm eating my hat. And even separate from sort of, comic book death, G.I. Joe has a history with this, with characters, leaving this mortal coil and returning, going back to the Marvel run. Mark, did you want to ask about the Nerf variant cover, since for a moment we're on issue 300?
I think you've almost asked the question, Tim. Yeah, we've got this strange variant cover with some wonderful art by Dave Johnson.
When Mark says strange, he also means awesome. It just means surprising and unusual.
Yes, thank you, Tim.
We are not at all offended by this cover. How did that come about? Whose idea? Who worked with who?
So that was the Nerf and G.I. Joe toy team were doing the blaster that the Nerf team came out with, which is the G.I. Joe anniversary themed blaster. And they came to me about maybe 9 months ago, I guess, and said, we'd love to put a comic in with this G.I. Joe blaster, and is there anything that we could do? And it was kind of funny because I was like, well, when are you going to announce it? And the timing was just so perfect. I was like, well, why don't we put the 300th issue in there, because that's a huge milestone for any comic, and it'll be relevant to the team that to the fans that are going to probably be interested in this Nerf blaster in particular, and for those who are coming at it more from the Nerf side and less on the G.I. Joe side because they want to own that particular blaster. It's going to give them a fun story that's also a kind of a collector's item in its own right, because it's the 300th issue. And and then the idea was like, well, how can we customize it? And we went back and forth on a few ideas, and then I just said, well, why don't we use the iconic issue number 1 cover, but just adapt it so that they're all carrying Nerf blasters instead of firearms. And I think it was meant to be kind of that, both a bit of a homage, but also a bit tongue in cheek, just in terms of having some fun with that design. And so that's it. So the interiors are exactly the same as issue 300, but that is the only place you can get that cover is with the Nerf blaster.
There's my cat. Okay, so packing a comic into a toy package is a different. The comic book is printed in Korea, I think, and so there are some different steps in getting this comic book into this toy package, because the toy package and the toy are made somewhere in particular, but that's out of your purview, right? You're sort of involved in the initial sort of definition of it, right?
Yeah, and in this case, Hasbro's printing themselves. So what we did was we had IDW give us the files, and to fix that logistical issue that you just mentioned, Tim.
Okay.
We will Hasbro will print themselves and then just pack it in. So we have had situations in the past where our comic book publisher prints the comics and then ships them, and then they have to get packed in, and it works. We've certainly done it that way quite a few times, but it is a few extra steps, and people are really kind of sitting on the edge of their seats until the last minute, because if anything disrupts the flow of those supply chains, then you can miss a lot of dates. So in a case like this, I think it was a good move to print on our own and do that.
So sort of just looking ahead to 2023, you've said that you're not going to give Talking Joe the scoop on who the new publisher is. We don't have that privilege, but there is a few things on public record. I listened to your very interesting interview with Adventures in Collecting podcast the other day, where you went into the details of the Stop the Bleed campaign for issue 300. So maybe just for the purposes of people who haven't yet listened to that, can you kind of let us know what is sort of public knowledge about the future of G.I Joe comics beyond November 2022?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, well, I guess I shouldn't say obviously. We have a plan, and the plan is already in motion. So I'm sure you've heard Larry say, and I've said it as well, that that 301 has been submitted and reviewed, and I know that Larry is already working on 302. What I would say to readers and fans is patience is going to be required for a bit of time, because it's not going to be January. It's going to be a little bit later on in the year before we start seeing anything come out. But it's all built. It's all in motion. We do have. It's funny. I sometimes see on the various boards. Like the other day, I think I saw somebody on his tank say, I think maybe Hasbro blew it, and they don't even have a new publisher. Well, I can assure you we do. We do have a new publisher. We are working very closely with that team, and we're full steam ahead. But the plan is that it's going to be a little while. So and I think that's normal. I think that's fairly normal. If you look back to any big transitions, it does take a little time to get a new team up to speed and to sort of figure out what we're doing and what exactly we want to come out with when the time is right. So, but not to fear. They're certainly, like I said, G.I. Joe's not gonna go away, at least while I'm while I'm the head of Hasbro Publishing.
I can speak for myself here. I had some patience between 1994 and 2001.
Yeah, right.
And then I had some patience between part of 2008 and part of 2008 when publishers changed. Some months into next year, I can wait.
Yep.
I've got issues to reread.
I do want to find out what happens to that C-130 though.
That's the other time that I sort of chuckled out loud and I explained to my wife, "Oh, it's a cliffhanger." And she said, "Oh, it didn't end?" And I said, "I thought it was going to end. I think we all thought it was going to end." and then start up again, but no, the final thing it says to be continued.
Yeah, and it's funny. I know that there are people who are disappointed in that, and I think, and I'm hoping that part of their disappointment is they aren't aware yet that there actually will be a to be continued, and that's all gonna, we will get to where we are picking that back up, and you will find out what happens to the C-130, etc. So all be assured that that's all going to happen. But it is funny too, because there was a time when you're just in this certainly in this business, you're just not sure. And so, talking to Larry, the original plan was, we're going to wrap it up and we're going to end it, because we don't really know if the new publisher is going to want to continue it or if there's going to be a new, but then, had some conversations with them, and I think there's just always an interest in keeping Real American Hero alive, because it is so core to the brand, and it is such an important story overall. And the idea of Larry still writing it, I think I just love it, because it's, here's Larry, who's been on this book since 1982. It's really is he said, G.I. Joe it's like coming home. And, I love the fact that he's going to keep writing that. And, you know, again, you have to wait a little bit of time, but it's going to happen. So, you know, for those who were hoping for a big, you know, resolution and end of the story, I guess I would just say maybe at issue 400.
You know, we've been talking on the show a lot about 300, what a milestone, you know, what's going to happen in it and what's going to be the grand conclusion, not quite suspecting that it's just going to be to be continued ... But you made the excellent observation of not just for G.I Joe 300 being such a milestone, but for comics in general, for a single writer to have such a long legacy on a book is so rare for someone to be working on a single story for such a long time, but also a single story with an unbroken numbering.
Right.
There are very few examples of creators doing that. It's something quite quite a landmark. Cool. I had one question which might be a little bit too specific, so Michael, so feel free to decline to answer. But in sort of looking at, you know, on Facebook and sort of the interactions from people asking questions about G.I. Joe comics and stuff, there's always people coming new to the brand or coming back from being a long way around. And at the moment, the 300 issue history of it is it's not necessarily the easiest thing to navigate, particularly because so many of the books have now become out of print. Is that something on your radar, do you think, of how to make that legacy of the comics accessible to sort of people discovering it new or coming back to it?
Yeah, one of the things that we always do, because, you know, Hasbro owns the copyrights and the trademarks, obviously, to all of these stories and these comics. So the good thing about that is that we can transfer those over to the new publisher. So the idea of, you know, down the road, you know, maybe 24, 25, having compendiums of the full Marvel run, the reprinted and brought back to market, certainly available digitally as well for those who like to read on devices rather than physical copies. That will all be open to us. So that opportunity is always available to the publisher, whoever they might be. So it's not like, oh, well, anything that IDW did, we can't use that anymore, or anything that Marvel did, we can't. That all just it all belongs to Hasbro. So we'll figure out what the right way to re-release that content is, but it's always going to be part of a broader plan in terms of keeping that material accessible to fans.
Excellent. Sounds like good news for people with holes in their back issues.
Yeah.
I think we've been talking to you a long time, and yeah. we warned you that we were talkers, so hopefully we've not kept you from something important. But thank you so much for being so generous with your time. It's been truly really interesting to sort of get your lens on this, because it's not really something that I've seen a huge amount of before, sort of the Hasbro side of the G.I Joe publishing story. So really interesting. Tim, did you have any last thoughts, comments?
Thank you so much for sharing your time and answering our questions, Michael.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure, and I really appreciate you giving me the time. To your point, it's not often that I get asked my perspective on these things, and it's fun. It's fun to talk about it because it's a big part of my life and something I'm really passionate about. And I think a lot of times people think of Hasbro just as, the suits, I guess, the corporate entity that owns the brands, but it's really not the case. I mean, there's a lot of people at Hasbro who love these brands and are passionate about them, and we come in every day trying to figure out how to make our fans excited and happy about the next thing. So, it was great talking to you guys. I appreciate the time.
Excellent. And definitely looking forward to whatever news comes out in the hopefully not too distant future, but some point other side of Christmas. Excellent.
Yep. great.
Okay, Tim, that was great. Nice to have Michael come on and tell us all about the behind the scenes of Hasbro, how this thing gets made.
This was exciting because I got to speak with Michael Kelly at HasCon several years ago, and I have bumped into him 2 other times at comic book conventions. And when you bump into someone at a convention, you don't necessarily feel like you can monopolize them for almost 2 hours. So,
and if you do, bad form.
what an opportunity on this podcast.
And what a scoop! Larry Hama definitely writing ARA until issue 400 at least. Fantastic. So, Tim, where can people find you when you are not talking to VPs of major corporations?
Video essays on television and film at Atomic Abe. My comic book store is Hub Comics in Somerville, Massachusetts, and I write about G.I. Joe at arealamericanbook.com.
Excellent. And if you are new to Talking Joe, you can find out all about us at our website, which is talkingjoe.co.uk, which has links to all of our social media, like our Facebook group, Twitter, Instagram, and all of that good stuff. You can also join in the fun as a Patreon, patreon.com/talkingjoe. And you can join all of the cool kids like Richard, Sam, Jay, Bill, Christopher, Justin, Rob, and Brian, who are all getting early access to episodes as well as some exclusive content. So I think that is us done, which leaves us only to remind people that
Nobody Beats Talking Joe, an international podcast.
We should have asked Michael to sing with us, really, but I thought that might be pushing it.